Thank you so much. It's great being here today, and thank you all for being here at 10 o'clock in the morning. I commend you. I hope you have coffee in your hands, because I think that this is going to be a really interesting discussion. We chatted a bit in preparation for this, and I think you'll find that, that we'll really try to tackle some of the big issues today. So I'm going to start out with what I think is one of the defining questions, and something that Frank Pascal talked about yesterday in his talk on stage one, if folks saw it, which is the role of a corporation in the 21st century with respect to human rights, freedom of expression, privacy. Full disclosure, in my work, I look at a number of different companies, including Google, various Google properties, in terms of how individuals feel that their content has been taken down on social networks. So it's called onlinecensorship.org, and we've been looking at that for a few years now. But I think it is a really big question that covers all of these different issues. So I would be curious just to hear, to start off, where you feel that, or what you feel that the role of a corporation is today.
It's a huge issue, as you point out, and I think that the role of a corporation is also constantly changing because of changing laws and changing balances, etc. But I think at the heart of it, the role of a corporation is to provide as good as possible a service as they can to their users. That's the first sort of baseline expectation that people have. And then on top of that, try to find a way to maximize and encourage free expression, creativity, and the open debate that the public discourse requires on top of that platform. Now, as you well know, that responsibility is then influenced by a number of different factors, and the ability to sort of maneuver is influenced by a number of different factors. So I think it's a good question to be asking, but it should be asked in context. So what is the shared, distributed responsibility for open debate in our societies? If you ask about the role of the corporation, you also necessarily have to ask about the role of citizens, but also the role of the state and the role of the regulator, and try to figure out how they all fit together. And that's a negotiation that we've been in for the last 20 years, ever since we were founded back in 1998. And I think it's one that's evolving, sometimes in a good way, sometimes not so much.
Well, then let me ask more specifically with respect to Google. Where do you see Google fitting into that landscape? Because I know when it comes to, for example, Facebook, they've been really staunchly opposed to being seen as a publisher. They've said, no, we're neutral, we're a technology company, and I would vehemently disagree with that personally. And so I'd be curious to see, you know, where you see Google's role in particular.
So I mean, we have a number of different roles because we have a number of different properties that we offer. One is YouTube, another is search, and I think that they are also different in terms of how they relate to the overall ecosystem. I think it's too simple to say that it's either a question of you being a publisher or not being a publisher. If you look at the way the public sphere has changed with the introduction of technology, you realize that entirely new roles have actually emerged. One of the things that I think is interesting is that when you have a situation of enormous information wealth, you have so much information out there, what is needed is somebody to curate it, certainly, somebody to host it, somebody to publish it with a sense of liability and editorial responsibility, but you also have a vast space that is information discovery. Search, for example, solidly sits in the information discovery niche in my way, which means that search necessarily needs to find out what is the best way to construct the public sphere information discovery mechanism. And that is by maximizing access to knowledge, to information, to whatever people are looking for. Not necessarily becoming a publisher with all of what that means. Information discovery and publishing are different. And I think that once we start understanding and studying this ecosystem and the different ways in which we all interact with the wealth of content out there, we see that different rules apply. So for search, that's very clearly the case. YouTube has more of a community approach to this, and essentially is trying to create a platform for users to create, speak their own voice, etc. And within that mission, it's also trying to create community guidelines that will allow the users to shape in different ways the kind of platform they want. So it's going to be different for different kinds of platforms, and I don't think it's not a binary choice of publishing or not publishing, I think.
I really like that answer, and I think I want to move to what we were chatting about just before we started, which was search. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to share just a quick story. A few days ago, a friend of mine asked, how many countries are there in the world? And a couple of us gave different answers, and I thought, okay, well, good thing we have Google. And we searched it, and what came back was what I now know is called a knowledge panel, those boxes that you see at the top of search. And it had a particular answer that was not incorrect, but not necessarily comprehensive. So obviously how many countries is a complex question that we're not up here to answer today. But I think that the knowledge panel is a really interesting thing. And I liked what you were saying before, this kind of question around the objectivity of information and whether that even can provide a complete answer. So what's your take on that? I mean, how do you see those as serving, and then where do you or do you see it as kind of a policy issue when these questions are more complex?
Oh yes, I mean it's a little bit of a question of what is a good response to a search. When you're asking a question, what's a good answer? Essentially, that's the kind of thing that our engineers are always thinking about and are trying to figure out new ways to answer that question in turn. And I think one of the things that we have certainly seen over the last 10 years or so that is that there's no natural necessity that the answer to a search is 10 blue links. In fact, this needs to evolve because people become more advanced, they become better at using information, and they want different kinds of responses. And on top of that, the vast amount of information that you have to search through increases all the time. According to some figures, and this is quite interesting, according to some figures, the amount of information digitally stored doubles every 12 months. It's a staggering observation if you think about it. If you believe that search quality is in some way related to the set of information you have to search through, you would then say that if you do nothing for this period of time, what will happen is that the quality of researchers will halve, right? So the essential challenge for anyone involved in search is to figure out ways to combat the enormous information explosion and try to get better answers to the questions people are asking. One way that we've done this is through the knowledge panels. The knowledge panels essentially are building on a kind of technology you can describe as a knowledge graph, where you try to map out what we know and how it relates to every single other thing out there. And this is an enormous undertaking because you have to start answering questions like, how many facts are there? How do you determine them? What is sort of a good, solid basis for determining fact? And it is tremendously hard. There's a couple of startups out there too that are working on this, and they essentially, I think the mission of one of them that was reported on New York Times, I think about a year ago or so, was to determine all the facts in the world. And asked how many they were, the answer was somewhat fleeting, because I think it's really hard to do that. Just look at search. 15% of the searches we get every single day are new. We haven't seen them before. These are questions that we don't see as recurring. So that's a real challenge. And I believe that for a search engine engaged in information discovery, you have to pursue several different avenues of innovation in order to become better in a space that's quickly exploding in information.
I think that with the knowledge panels, they also have the possibility of returning incorrect information. And I know that that's something that Google has worked on and is always actively working to fix. But I think that that's a good segue to talk about the issue that everyone's calling fake news. And all full disclosure here that I personally feel that this binary of fake news and real news is part of the problem. And I've heard people say that here in the past day as well, that by kind of drawing that line in the sand and saying all of this is correct, all of this is not correct, that we're really just perpetuating the issue. And so I guess first I would just say for those in the room who aren't familiar, where does Google see its role in tackling this fake news crisis? And then I'd also just love to hear your thoughts on how you see this as an issue.
So fake news, in a sense, is not new for a company that's been engaged in working on information quality for most of its time. Fake news or other kinds of low-quality information has always been a problem for search. The key issue to observe is that the web is an adversarial environment. Everyone is not working together collaboratively in order to get to the best possible environment. People are working to further their own interests. That's why, we've had for the longest time these enormous problems with search spam. If you go back to the introduction of Google search and you do sort of a brief overview of the history of search, you can see that the first kinds of search engines out there were very simple. They did linguistic frequency analysis. They would look at a page and they would look at how many times does a word actually occur, and they would use that as the basis of their ranking. Once that method was tried in an adversarial environment, it completely broke down. If you go into archive.org and you look at old web pages, you will find web pages that are like this much text and this much scrolling line where there's white text on white background to attract people. Which is really interesting, right? I mean, it's like you have, Britney Spears, white text, white background for the entire page. And it completely broke the linguistic frequency search model. And what we've seen over time is that this adversarial this tension is moving from spam up into more and more semantic layers. So people are constantly competing for attention in different ways, because attention is something that can change societies, that can change purchasing patterns, etc. And then in the midst of all of that, you have to figure out how you retain information quality, which is increasingly a hard problem. So I think the way we see it is that this is an extension of the information quality problem, but with an added order of difficulty, because you're trying to decide semantically if something is fake or not, if it's valuable or not. And that's really, really hard to do. Now, there are some simple things we can do. When somebody is obviously misrepresenting themselves as a news organization, you can shut off the ads for that organization. Things like that sort of follow the money and stop the money flow to those who are willfully just spewing noise into the system. So those are certainly things that we do. And the other things we're trying to do is to very pointedly show that this is not something that a single actor in this ecosystem can solve. Just as we came back to the question of responsibility earlier, it's a question of how you build this ecosystem out. So we're, for example, enabling different kinds of standards and information markups for fact checkers, so that they can work within this ecosystem to mark up information quality as well. And so it's a complex problem, it is not new, and it stems from the fact that the web is a deeply adversarial environment.
Like, the web is a deeply adversarial environment. That's quite quotable. And I don't think anyone here would disagree, yeah. Great, well then I guess I would like to follow up on that and say, I'm starting to feel like we live in a society where evidence-based thought is kind of on the decline. It feels that way, at least. It feels that way in the sort of polarization of politics that we're seeing in Europe, in the United States, in a number of different places in the world. Is fact-checking even going to be enough? Are facts, do facts hold the same meaning if everything is a construct? And so I guess I would say, what more can we as humans do? Not just as companies, not just as our role in the world, but what more can we as humans do to solve this issue?
And it's such a good question, because at the end of the day, we spoke in the beginning about there being a responsibility for citizens as well. I recently finished, Jay Rosen, I think, I may be misquoting this, wrote a biography of Justice Brandeis. And in this biography, there's this fascinating set of quotes from Justice Brandeis in which he says that leisure time is the time you spend becoming a better citizen. That's how you engage in society, democracy, strengthen it, how you invest in the institutions of democracy in order to strengthen it. And it's your duty as a citizen to do that. It's a way of viewing how we participate in democracy that is almost completely outdated in a sense. It's very hard to find corresponding views to those of Justice Brandeis today. And I think Justice Brandeis' point that we do have an individual responsibility when it comes to determination of fact, participation in democracy, the production of knowledge, for example, is quite right. And there's no simple fix to this. There's no technical fix to what you're describing. And I think that's really important to remember. There's no dial to turn up or down. There's no switch to flip that will make this kind of problem go away. This is about how we view our democracy and how we want to participate in it and how we invest in it in time and effort, and that is going to be up to us. That's why if you look at Aristotle, the ethics precedes the politics in Aristotle's work. There's a very real reason for that, because you have to have your ethics right first, your personal responsibilities, and then you can start with your politics.
I like that as well. I think that the question of participating in democracy and what sorts of things we expect from our democracies at this point, in this current era where I think we're all feeling this kind of tension, brings me to something that I think we actually Google, we personally, but also Google and myself, my organization, probably share an opinion on, which is the hate speech bill here in Germany. I just want to pull up my phone to make sure I get this quote right. So there was a recent civil society letter that I understand some of the industry associations that you're part of signed on to, but also that was signed by the Chaos Computer Club and Digitale Gesellschaft and a number of German organizations. And in that letter it said that Internet service providers play an important role in combating illegal content by deleting or blocking it. However, they, meaning internet service providers, should not be entrusted with the governmental task of making decisions on the legality of content. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with that. I think that if you are, and it's also a question of how you actually want your information flow in a democracy to evolve over time. I don't think that it's a good idea to put that decision over on corporations. Specifically not if you look at the way the hate speech law is construed, with enormous penalties, very short response times. If you have enormous penalties and short response times, it is quite clear that you are creating a risk that people who don't have a lot of resources or not able to put a lot of thought into this or push a lot of reviewers towards it are simply just going to default to takedown, which means that the overreach that such a legal construction leads to will be quite significant. And I think that is a real risk to free expression. And some of these things, some of these institutions, some of these decisions, the state needs to retain and needs to still have as a part of what it means to be a democratic core institution. I think that's very, very accurate.
I think I absolutely agree with that. I think, though, when it comes down to the sort of role of companies engaging with states on censorship, I want to not really push back, but also kind of broaden this out a little bit, expand it to say that a lot of the companies, I think YouTube in this case, Facebook, do comply with laws that they don't necessarily, that people in those companies do not necessarily feel are just. And I think Turkey is a really good example of this. I know that there are a couple of talks on that here this week. Where do you feel that the company's role is in compliance in that sense? Where do you feel that they should draw a line and say, okay, enough, we're not going to be complicit in this kind of censorship?
So I think in many ways what you're asking is, what do you as a company say about a legal decision in a country where you're present? If you are present in a country, if you made the choice to be present in a country, you've also implicitly made the choice to abide by that country's laws and rules to a high degree. And I think that is sort of a basic consideration that all companies need to bring into this discussion. Now, there are some decisions where you can certainly push back, and you can push back against the legal basis of it, and you can challenge it in court, and we've done that in several cases in several different countries. And I think what you do at that point is that you try to combat the decision within the legal framework in which it was taken. And I think that's something that companies actually should do to a large degree, and they should challenge these decisions within that legal framework. At the end of the day, though, if you look at the way that democracies are expected to work, a democracy, a democratically elected government has the right to restrict information to its citizens according to its constitutional framework and according to law. So what I think would be good, given that there is so much discussion about this, is to provide much more accountability and transparency in how that is done. And we have a transparency report. We were the first company to launch a transparency report where we reported through all of these different things. But really, companies shouldn't do that. Governments should do that. Governments should say, here are the different ways in which we restrict information. Here are the different ways in which we request information about you as our citizens. And here are many times we've used them. And here is, the different kinds of ways in which you can change those rules should you disagree with them. That should be a national reporting duty for governments, because they would then provide transparency into those regimes and give citizens a chance to discuss them and citizens a chance to change them if they don't agree with them.
Oh, now I'm excited to talk about transparency. No, I agree with you. I think that governments should, but we also know that in a lot of cases they won't. To give a story about a different company, there was a scenario a couple of years ago where EFF saw that a company was complying with orders from prisons in the United States. And that was a real problem because there was no transparency around that, because it was not, it was not the same kind of legal request that had existed previously in that company's transparency report. Eventually, things were settled, it was changed, the policy was changed. But I think that shows that even if the US, which seeming less and less democratic these days, but even if the US is not complying, then it's unreasonable to maybe expect Turkey at this point to do so. And so in that sense, I would say I agree. Google's been an absolute pioneer in transparency reporting. Our Who Has Your Back report that we've been putting out for quite some time, I think Google has all the stars, I believe. I didn't check the most recent one. But do you see now as now as companies are sort of expected to take on more when it comes to content moderation, to regulate content that is not necessarily illegal. I know, Google doesn't do this quite as much as some other companies, but there are still areas where that happens. Do you see a role in these transparency reports for more transparency around that kind of issue, around terms of service censorship?
Yes, I do. I think that that's a very reasonable question. I think that's something, I will not be revealing any state secrets if I tell you we've been discussing this for a long time. The right way to do it, so it becomes meaningful and it becomes informative and it becomes something that users can use to make their own decisions about whether or not it's right or wrong. This is an evolving topic, and I think that if we have this discussion in a couple of years, you will have seen new governance institutions like that, for example, have evolved within companies. And I think that is probably the right way to go about this. Companies, I think, can only gain from providing more transparency into how these decisions are made, because at the end of the day, users should judge them on the past behavior and try to decide whether or not they trust them based on their past behavior. That is the only way in which you can generate the kind of trust you need to continue delivering your services. And I think that, again, should be complemented by transparency from governments about how these different rules are applied, which is also, when it comes to things like the German hate speech law, why I believe it's a bad idea to push all of this over to companies, because then the state doesn't need to take responsibility nor accountability for the kinds of decisions that are made, which is, again, something that stops citizens from changing those decisions.
Absolutely. So beyond the issue of speech regulation, I think that there's something here too around hate speech and around counter-extremism. And so I wanted to raise Jigsaw, which is a part of. I feel like I'm getting this wrong these days. So Alphabet, Google, Jigsaw. Am I understanding the
Alphabet,
Jigsaw, Google. Okay.
Yes.
I apologize.
I think, but
I need the flow chart. Like, we should have put that up behind us. It's complicated. But so this whole space, So I know that Jigsaw is focused on anti-extremism. That's one of their areas of focus. And I think, this is a place where companies maybe feel that they have to step up in some way, beyond just regulating the content, beyond just taking down the videos, because that may not even be the best solution. For example, we've heard from some police departments in a number of places in the world that the taking down of the content without any further context is not even necessarily helpful, that doesn't allow them to track, it doesn't allow archiving, etc. And so I think that this is admirable work, but at the same time, right now, given the rise of white supremacy and fascist ideologies in Europe, in the US, in a number of places, where does Google see its role in countering or combating those ideas as well? Not just Islamic extremism, but also these other really prevalent forms of extremism.
Well, I think that obviously it's something that a company can't do alone. Even Jigsaw acknowledges that radicalization is a complex, multi-layered process, right? It doesn't happen we have no evidence that it happens because somebody sits in front of a screen and sees a number of videos or a number of posts in a social network and then decides to become an extremist. Usually that is about the identity building part, and the radicalization happens offline in a small community where somebody is recruited. So the radicalization process and the de-radicalization process are deeply complex processes. And Jigsaw has chosen to, for now, focus on the Islamic radicalization process. Now, there's a reason that Jigsaw is not a part of Google. They want to try all of these different things, and was decided early on that it's better for them to do that as a freestanding company, and they should speak for themselves, and they have their own ideas about how to put this forward. Jared Cohen and Scott Carpenter are more than happy to come talk about these issues. The reason we did the radicalization project with them from Google's side was we felt that there was a clear use case there for the redirect project we did. When somebody looking for information that is essentially going to be radicalization information is redirected to counter-speech, because we felt that was a clear case where we could test counter-speech in this particular environment. Now, will we do that for other kinds of extremism as well? I don't know. I mean, we're still evaluating the results of the redirect experiment and what we believe what that led to. We do know that it led to a lot of exposure for people who were looking for radicalization content, but we don't necessarily know what the impact of that is. As you point out, it's a deeply complex process, because if you are feeling that the entire world is conspiring against you and stopping you from get to the content that you really need, and that there's this paternalistic element to it, then maybe you actually end up making the situation worse. So you want to be very careful, you want to look at limited cases, and you want to understand how they work, and that's essentially where we are now. So it's very early in the process. Now, Jigsaw may well have another answer to that question. I think they should duly be asked it in their own right.
Excellent. Well, I will do my best to ask them in the future. I think, I'm also really curious about your thoughts on just where the internet is headed. There's, I know that this is a really big question. I know that, but we've been kind of talking around these ideas when it comes to hate speech, when it comes to the sort of different types of knowledge that people have access to and censorship. And I think that now we're seeing an increasing, I'm not going to use the word balkanization, fragmentation of the internet. What do you see as your role there in ensuring that people do have some sort of universalized access to information? I mean, from my perspective, governments are working together a lot of times to collude in oppression. And I think that people also have this responsibility to work together across borders and across boundaries in solidarity with each other. But when our access to information differs, and sometimes even with the help of companies, that can be a difficult task.
Our mission statement is to organize all the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. And I think that we are committed to try to do that as best as we can within existing laws and legal regulations. And, where we can have an open debate and a policy debate about how those regulations can be changed in order to achieve that goal. That's very clear to us. I think that universal information access is actually a very important point when it comes to how we can change democracies and how we can get to a shared worldview, etc. On where the internet is heading, though, I mean, there's a couple of different things happening that I think are really difficult. Take hate speech, for example, just as one single factor that we can study in order to understand what's happening right now. There is a push in a lot of Western democracies, for good reason, because this is felt to be a real problem, to regulate hate speech and to regulate it in quite a heavy-handed way, which means that you end up having regulation that might deter companies from allowing any kind of spirited debate, if you will, on their platform. And I think that's very different than hate speech, but it may have a chilling effect. And what will happen then is not that this will disappear. I mean, there was a research report recently from Pew, back, I think, published on the 29th of March, where they asked a number of experts in the internet community what they think the next steps are. And they say, we think we see more hate speech, but we think that we will also see it move from a public stage to a semi-public stage into other kinds of networks. And it will fragment the internet because different kinds of content rules will be applied differently in different places. And I think that the content regulation we're discussing now in several different parts of the world actually has the ability to create content islands on the internet. So you get an archipelago of different kinds of discussions, and then they are separated off because of regulatory concerns. So of course you can see that happening. And then you can ask yourself, look, if you have a guy who says, I really, really dislike Swedes on an open arena, right? That is, not nice. I think that's pretty bad. But if he goes into a small room with like-minded people and say, I really dislike Swedes, what is most dangerous for our society? To have him in that closed room together with like-minded people, or to have him on an open arena? We haven't had that discussion. We just assume that we can sort of remove hate speech, which I think is a little bit like fighting a symptom rather than thinking about the core causes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's like putting a Band-Aid on this open and terrible wound and thinking, oh, okay, this is going to go away, but it doesn't. And I think that we've seen this in the way that imagery is regulated. I mean, I know that when I go to Budapest, for example, I can see, stand-in symbols that indicate that this shop is owned by Nazis. The Confederate flag, the American Confederate flag, is commonly used there as a stand-in symbol because this other one has been made illegal. So I may not recognize that immediately, and I think that there is a real danger there to siloing off networks of hate. Yeah. I want to change tacks just a little bit, because that was just a superb answer, and move toward automation. I'm going to be not advertising this, but I'm running off to my next talk after this and talking a lot about automation and algorithms, and so I have to take this opportunity and ask for your thoughts, particularly for the role of automation and content moderation. I think right now there's a lot of talk about the labor involved, the post-traumatic stress disorder involved with content moderators who have to look at this terrible imagery every day. And there's a lot of empathy for them and a lot of trying attempts to create something different. But at the same time, I'm concerned that automation will bring in the same sorts of human biases that we see now. And so I'm curious where you see this headed.
Well, I think that, first and foremost, you're absolutely right. The people who are forced to review this stuff, they are doing a really, really difficult job. And as a company, you have a responsibility to make sure that they get the kind of support they need in that very difficult job. So I think that's important to say first. Then I think that this is a problem it is a problem that can be separated into two different things. The first is, can we? Is it possible within the existing computer science knowledge to build a system that can automatically do content regulation and decide that this little piece of content here is hate speech and this little piece of content over here should stay up? I think that we are still a way away from that, being able to do that. And I think that the notion of context, the ability to detect context, is really hard. It's an open computer science problem, if you want. So that's the sort of can we perspective. I don't think that it's possible to do within any kind of confidence interval that we would feel roughly comfortable with. Now, assuming we can, just for sort of the sake of argument, assume that we have a system that has learned to identify some content that is hate speech and some that isn't. Would we still want to delegate this decision to a system or not? That is a much more difficult question, I think, because it might be true for some kinds of content. And this is where we need to get nuanced, and this is where it gets messy. If you run a platform and you don't want pornography on that platform, you might be able to build a system that could detect pornography with a certain high level of confidence. And the false positives of that detection may be, people on beach, or people participating in some kind of nude stuff, right? and those false positives may not be high-value content, and if they are actually removed from the public debate, you may not think that that's a huge loss, and you could correct it with an appeals process and a reinstatement process, etc. Now, if you go to something like hate speech, and you start looking at the nature of the false positives, which is sort of the research problem that you have to engage in, you realize that the nature of the false positives when it comes to hate speech is much more difficult to address, because you may be filtering out counter speech, for example, or you may be filtering out other things like that. So I think that we're still at the can we stage, and no, we can't. And so that sort of settles the issue for now. But moving ahead, the question is, will we ever be able to? I don't know what the answer to that is. It depends on a little bit of how complex this problem is. It may well be really complex. I personally think it's so complex because, again, the web is an adversarial environment. You made a really, really good point about the flag. If I build a system today that essentially allows me to detect certain kinds of markers for white supremacists, for example, and that system picks out all of that speech. Now, what will they do? They will change the words, right? This is the exact same kind of fight that you see in spam, but you will end up with that, and the code words, etc., will change over time, and that system again is a system in evolution and competition, and you're going to end up having to try to push the boundaries. If that change is always going to be fluid enough to keep confidence intervals lower than we want them to be, we're never going to be able to do it. So there's a will we ever be able to question too. But assuming that we will be able to, should we, I think still is a really big issue. And I don't have a good answer for you. And I won't pretend that we are not all discussing this in the internet community. I had a discussion last week with a professor about this as well, and he essentially said that it is a decision also that needs to be informed by the risk of future discovery of bias. Because if you assume now that you have a really good, if you assume that you had this system in the 1930s, and you put it in place, everybody would agree it's not biased, it's working really well, it's sorting out all of the anti-whatever stuff. And then you look at it now, 60 years in hindsight, and you say, my God, it's terribly biased, right? Because our view of bias changes over time. So there's a whole set of issues there that are unresolved. And I think we should, as a community, continue to debate them, because I think that we will soon see somebody out there saying, oh, it's quite possible to do, because they've built a system that they have faith in and they want to be able to do it.
Is there anything right now for which Google is using algorithms to pull things, or even just to flag them rather than having human moderators?
Mostly human moderators right now. There's a couple of very simple ways of identifying when flags become, enough flags for a particular subject or something has been flagged before. There's an automation there, but nothing on the scale of what you're discussing. This idea of sort of applying it to content moderation, which is essentially a human task today.
Absolutely. No, I agree that it's a really tricky problem, and I don't have the right answer either. I want to go to the audience in just a moment, but I think I had one last question that I wanted to ask first, and perhaps I don't. Well, I have so many things that I want to ask you, but I also want to make sure that I give plenty of time to the audience to ask questions. So do we have any just yet? Otherwise, I can keep going up here. We do.
I wanted to ask, I was interested in what you were saying about the citizens' responsibility to discriminate, essentially, between content, and it's our responsibility as citizens to engage. I just wonder, given the education that we have received as citizens, even amongst people much younger than me, is not in step with the technological change. So as citizens, we're equipped to engage in a society which has gone, and whether there is a responsibility from the producers of the technology that is changing our society, so people like yourselves, to help equip the citizens to make those choices.
Thanks. Yeah, so we are engaged, as you probably know, in a number of different digital literacy projects, and those are addressed at kids, but they're also addressed at grown-ups. We are doing something called the Growth Engine Project, which teaches digital skills across Europe, and I think that's part of it. Now, I actually think that it's really important to talk about education overall and how education needs to change in our society and why it might be important for us to constantly re-educate ourselves vis-a-vis technology. So we provide a lot of online content, etc., but at the end of the day, that's also dependent on the individual's will to seek that content out and to change it. The key, I think, is, as you say, trying to figure out how you fit this into basic education. Now, there are some signs of hope. I'm a native Swede, and my kids have this enormously annoying thing that they're doing through classes 4 to 6. It's called check the source. So what happens is that every time something every time a proposition is being brought forward, they are taught to say check the source, and then they go off and they turn into fact checkers and they check a lot of different sources, etc., etc. And they're supposed to do this 150 times over the course of a year. So they're really it's ingrained into them. Now the annoying part of this is that every time I tell them to clean their room, they say check the source, and they disappear, which is a bit of a bother. But the overall sentiment there is really, really good. And I do believe that this is classical critical thinking and something that needs to be embedded in education. I don't know if you read science fiction, but Werner Winge wrote a really interesting book called a while back, I think it was 1999, called Rainbow's End, in which the guy who has Alzheimer's is cured of Alzheimer's and has to go back to school because he has to relearn everything. And there are only 2 subjects in school in Winge's version of the future. One is search and analytics, which is essentially critical thinking, and the other is visualization, in order to be able to visualize complex information. Those are the 2 only school subjects. And maybe we should think about educational reform in order to equip us with better tools to deal with this.
I would love to go back to the German law about hate speech that you've been talking about. I think the gist of what you were saying about it might be forcing companies with less resources to just have it like a default solution for this problem. So let's get rid of it, even if it's just controversial and not really hate speech. So it's much easier not to incur in those kind of very big fines. But the problem is, I've been following this closely from Germany, from here, for the publication. And so the problem is this has been ongoing, especially with Facebook, for more than 2 years. And so self-regulation was the first choice for the government. And there was a big push for self-regulation. But it didn't work at all. It didn't work at all. For 2 years, Facebook, I'm saying Facebook because the numbers show that Google actually did a great job. And not because you're here, but because it's just the mass ministry, so the justice ministry just showed numbers. Your numbers went up. Facebook's number in actually addressing illegal content. We're not even talking about stuff that cannot be deemed as controversial. It was clearly illegal. They were not able to pursue that properly. Their percentages of illegal content that was just reported just went down. So what is the government to do at some point? There's political push on that. So there has to be something done, and what the politics have in their hands is just regulating in ways that, yeah. So what do you think about this bigger issue of how to tackle that?
I know that you can't say this, but I can. I mean, I have to think at some point with Facebook that it's willful, because they're excellent at taking down any image of a woman's breast, but they cannot seem to deal with hate speech. And I can assure you, I've been banned for posting breast cancer campaigns on Facebook before. It's unfathomable that they can't tackle this issue. But I mean, from my perspective, I do feel that since Google, I mean, and I've seen that as well, Google was capable of this. I think companies are capable of it. Look, I mean, I don't think that companies, for the most part, should be forced into this situation. I do understand where you're coming from with respect to this one company, but I see this as a problem with one company, not a problem across the board that needs to be solved with this sort of rapid law. But I'll turn it to you to see where you stand on it.
Yeah, I won't comment on Facebook. Yes, I won't, and you're not allowed to legislate for a company. I think that's a good point. But I do think, I mean, there are a couple of different things here that I believe are really important. One is that I think that the entire industry has said that we're willing to come to the table and discuss, see what can be done, how this can be improved, what we can do. We believe this particular piece of legislation is not necessarily going to solve the problem that you're looking at, and it's going to have a lot of adverse effects. So let's not push a law through very quickly. I understand the sense of desperation that a politician can feel. Also because many of them are on the receiving end of this, and they're standing up for democracy. They're trying to really participate, and I think that if you look at what politicians are doing, they are exposing themselves to this problem a lot. So I can understand the sense of desperation. But I think there are some things that we can do that doesn't have to entail pushing through an overreaching law. One thing that we can do that actually should be done is to look at the existing enforcement of the hate speech laws that are there. What kinds of resources are being poured into this? How much are we actually trying to take these laws and take these cases and bring them to court? What is the resources of the court system to deal with this? Are there special prosecutors that can work on this, for example, with transparent means and with revision, etc.? Or all of those things should be discussed and can be discussed. So we have said several times in meetings with anyone who will listen that we're happy to come to the table and discuss what can be done. And there may be other things we can do in terms of shared responsibility, where we would discuss what the role of companies and governments are. But this is not it. It is not going to have the kind of effect that you're looking for. And then it would be much better to look at enforcement and look at alternative solutions, I think.
Do we have more questions?
Yeah. Hi. If I'm not mistaken, Google actually makes 90% of its revenue from advertising. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so basically Google is an advertising company whose business is to influence people on behalf of its advertisers, which gets back to Jillian's original point of what's the role of a corporation. And I have to say I'm very troubled by the idea of experimenting on people, even if it's for good, to try to move them away from, radical sites. I find this is human experimentation, and Google is already doing this on behalf of advertisers.
Well, it's a valid point. We make our money from advertisers, and we're not shy about it. It's not a secret. I think that one of the things that I believe is really important is that when you talk about the jigsaw experiment is that it's done in a structured fashion, that we're very clear about what's happening, and that we're very transparent about it. You may disagree, and you may feel that that is the kind of thing we should never do. I think that's a valid standpoint to take, and it's one that we don't share. We disagree with it. We think that we can do this within the remit we have. On advertising generally, I think the idea of advertising and funding what we do with advertising is that we help people find what they're looking for. We help them do it through organic search, and we help them do it for advertising. Now, you can quite legitimately take the position that all advertising is a bad thing, and there should be no advertising in society. I disagree with that too. I think advertising is a really powerful way to reach consumers, and it's a part of a market economy. And we may have a fundamental disagreement about whether or not a market economy is a good thing or not, and then we could go on and we could discuss that and the basic tenets of how we build our society. But for us, we're a company, we're providing an advertising technology. The revenue of that we pour into a lot of different projects. I think that in many senses we believe that we are doing a lot of good with those projects, and we will continue doing so. However, I understand and respect your position.
Yeah, when the two big players, Google and Facebook, they pretty much, for many people right now, replaced what the internet was. They become the internet. Especially Facebook really tries hard to be the internet for millions and billions of people. So I'm somewhat troubled when these companies move past anything we experienced before from a company and yet still claim something. Well, we as a company need to have a moral background. We need to have our moral guidelines. No, you don't. You're beyond the role of picking or choosing moral rules to implement, because looking at Facebook and the ban on women's breasts, that's a good example on where this goes. So you shouldn't be in the role to stop or enforce or do anything on any part of free speech, because this really goes out of hand because you're already far too powerful.
I think we're not the internet, and that's a very good point, and we realize that internally. We're absolutely not the internet. We provide certain services, and on those services we do believe we have the right to determine roughly what goes and what doesn't. And you could say, well, you are so large now that I disagree with that. I think that you should not make any decision about what goes on your platform or not. We disagree with that position. We believe that we should be able to decide what goes and does not go on our platforms. We don't believe that extends to all of the internet, and we do think that the internet is changing quite fast, and there will be new services and there will be other competitors, and that will go on. Then I think that all of those values can be questioned. You know, if you disagree with our values, you should definitely let us know, because the way we try to shape our guidelines on YouTube, for example, is from listening to users, what they want, what they don't want, you know, what kinds of content they don't like. That's why the flagging system is so valuable to us. We see people flagging and we try to respond to that. Now, we don't always act on the flags. We're not completely governed by the flags. If we were, for example, there are a couple of pieces of music by Justin Bieber that would be picked down because people flag Justin Bieber all the time, which is very confusing. And so this is so this is something that is a part of running a service. You have to decide what you want to actually have on that service or not. There is a living debate that is representing exactly what you say. People who say, well, your service has now crossed a threshold where it's so large as not to be able to do that anymore, and you should refrain from any moral judgment. I don't think that's possible. I think it's a moral judgment or a moral decision even to provide a service. So I think that's a point where I disagree.
Can I follow up on that real quick and just say that I think that a really interesting example of this that came about recently was YouTube restricting or adding a restricted mode that would segment some LGBTQ videos off to the side. I know YouTube has apologized for this and that most of those videos are now available, but at the same time, that is a company passing a judgment on what is, let's say, acceptable for adults versus children, or people who want adult content versus not. And to be clear, these were not all sexual in nature. Some were, some were not. From my perspective, I think that there's perhaps a diversity issue within the companies when these decisions are made. And I know Google does produce a diversity report. I know that in terms of global diversity, at least, it ranks much higher than a lot of the other companies. But I still see this as perhaps an issue coming out of Silicon Valley, and I would just be curious.
Diversity is certainly important. I think diversity in making these decisions is absolutely essential. We did apologize. I think we made a mistake, and when we make mistakes, we back off of that. And this was discussed at the very highest levels. Susan, who leads YouTube, was deeply involved in this, and of course she also was deeply involved in walking this decision back. We will make mistakes. We will own up to them, and we will try to fix them. That is unfortunately the reality of a fairly complex system.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I would like to come back to the technology aspect, and in the announcement there was conversation, AI and perspective was mentioned in the text, and maybe I've overheard that, but I didn't listen to anything about that. Could you explain a little bit what these tools or softwares are?
This is another jigsaw project that is essentially about trying to help publishers decide what kind of tone of voice they want in the commentary space of their website. So it's something that is provided for publishers to decide how they moderate their comments. It uses a basic AI to detect certain kinds of speech patterns that can then be judged and judged to be appropriate or not appropriate by the publisher. So it's not a decision taken by us, but it's an AI applied to this comment space. And as we said before, the confidence rates here are very difficult, and the reports about this particular piece of technology has varied in terms of how effective it is. Yet publishers are really interested in it because they would like, the ideal for them would be to have a way of setting the tone of voice in the discussions that follow on to the quality content that they produce. And so Jigsaw tried to figure out if there was a way to do that, and it's more of a jigsaw question. I saw that was in the announcement too, and I was hoping I wouldn't get any machine learning questions. Because then
Thank you very much for this session. Usually we have a definition of what is legal and what's not legal to put out as expressions, both hate speech and blasphemy and other things that are decided by parliaments and by courts. How would you look at integrating the decisions made by courts into automated systems?
So, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking whether or not you could take a decision by a court that in some way interprets a law on what's legal or not legal in terms of content, and then integrate that into an automated removal system. Well, I think that the challenge there would be that you have to code it in such a way that it actually represents accurately the gist of the conceptual analysis in the decision. Now, that would require that the decision analysis in court decisions is somewhat standardized. Now, you can imagine a world in which you actually standardize the conceptual analysis of a piece of content according to a way that's machine readable, that you could immediately import into a system. There's been discussions of that kind when it comes to courts, and I think that there are a lot of really interesting research tracks on what's called cyber courts, where the decisions are essentially coded in such a way that they're completely transferable between different kinds of systems. So if you have a court decision over here, you can import it into a moderation system over here. That asks a profound question about the nature of law and legal concepts. Aren't law and legal concepts such that they're amenable to that kind of conceptual modeling or coding? I'm not sure they are. I tend to believe, when it comes to legal philosophy, I'm a pragmatist. I believe with Oliver Wendell Holmes and others that law changes, that societies change, which means that any codification of it in a particular moment will be a snapshot of what the law looks like in that particular moment, and it conceptually will not be stable over time. The language game around law changes, which means that it won't be possible to actually import a coded decision just from one instance to another. You can do some things to I guess, at least. You could, another way of asking your question would be, should these decisions then be used and provided in a format that can be used for training machine learning systems? So you train classifiers on them in order to train these classifiers to moderate content. And that might be quite interesting too. But yet again, that asks a profound question about the nature of legal concepts, where I tend to be on the skeptical side of whether it would work or not. But it's a very valuable research question.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for the very interesting panel. Changing the topic slightly, I know that Google has been very proactive in promoting sustainability, such as solar panels to power your offices and data centers. Are you able to just share a little bit more on that and other initiatives that you guys are actively introducing or practicing to enable sustainable development? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, of course. No, we do believe this is a really important question. We are, since several years back now, carbon neutral. You can discuss the efficiency of the offset system, but we buy carbon offsets for when people like me travel across the world, etc. So we're truly a carbon neutral company. We're looking at different kinds of sustainable energy investments across the field. And especially when it comes to our data centers, we've been very careful about how we locate them in order to be able to look at new ways of utilizing energy. For example, there's a data center in Hamina that uses offshore wind power in different ways in order to power the data center as such. It is a key question, and for that reason, the sustainability work is actually in Google proper. It's not in Alphabet. It's been decided that it's a core part of what Google does. And there are several different other projects ongoing, and we were happy to provide you with an overview. I don't have them all in my head, but an overview if that can be helpful to you in some way.
I didn't know that. That's very cool. I didn't know that Google was carbon neutral. I think we've got time for probably 1 to 2 more questions.
I will come back to the algorithms and machine learning. I'm sorry, but it really seems very relevant in this discussion. My feeling is that many companies propose algorithm as the solution for the problem that was created possibly by the use of algorithms in the first place. So we see how, for example, fake news get certain visibility online because of the algorithm behind that promotes the content that will trigger more interactions. That's less Google example, that's more Facebook, I think, example. And then the company like Facebook responding with the same idea, now we will teach our algorithms to ignore this kind of content. So my question to you would be how much you believe in transparency and opening those black boxes. Do you see any risks inherent into doing that? So, for example, we open the algorithm and then people start gaming them even more. On the other hand, if they are being gamed by botnets anyway, maybe we should be opening it. What's your take on algorithm transparency in the context of fake news and similar problems?
So, there are a couple of tiers to your question that I would like to ask. The first one is are algorithms really generating a filter bubble? This is a real research question that people are looking into. And just a couple of days ago, the University of Michigan, Oxford University, and University of Ottawa released a 203-page report where they looked at the use of search and political opinion, formation of political opinion. And they have it's a really interesting report, and there's a couple of things in there that I think are salient to what you're asking. One of them is that people actually do not only look at content that confirms their own prejudice. They look at 4.5 sources on average. They'll seek out sources are different from the ones that they typically see. And maybe this behavior is different in social networks. I don't know. The study doesn't say. But the notion of sort of having a filter bubble be generated by your search pattern seems to be one that is not proven by research. It's rather challenged by it. So that's an important first part of the question to answer. Second part is, how do you think about algorithmic transparency? And I think there are 2 answers to that. One is the one that you gave yourself. If you put the algorithm out there in an adversarial environment, what will happen is it will be gamed and you will be lost in the noise. And that's not a great idea. But that answer is only partially true. I think that the more problematic question there is that if you look at what is happening today, it's actually better to try to explain outcomes than explain the algorithms, because the algorithms are constantly becoming more and more complex, and it's not certain that you would be able to make any decisions or informed analysis by just looking at a series of neural nets and how they're trained at a certain data set. You would be able to see the algorithm, but you would not be able to predict the outcomes because of the level of complexity inherent in the system that you're trying to audit. So at that point, what becomes important is that you're able to do statistical analysis of the outcomes and that you're able to talk about the outcomes. So for search, for example, what we want to be very transparent is about how you can rank higher. How can you provide better quality content? So we have something called How Search Works, which is a broad campaign that goes in depth on all of the different things we look at. And at this point, it's more than 250 different signals we look at when we try to determine the quality of content. And it's going to grow and it's going to increase, which means that every single piece of content that we look at will be determined by a lot of different signals. So when we can talk about how that happens, it's actually more useful than just talking about the algorithm behind it. And this has to do with levels of explanation. If you want to understand how a car works, and I start teaching you about quantum physics, you're not necessarily going to be helped by that, because quantum physics does describe how the car works, but the explanation is going to be really long and complex. But if I talk about mechanics, certainly you have another understanding of the car, and then you can do things with the car. And it's a bit the same thing with computer systems. Talking about the algorithms is a little bit like talking about quantum physics, when what you actually want to do is to talk about what the algorithm does and the outcome analysis of the algorithm. So it's levels of explanation, and it's levels of explanation that help you be as transparent about what you're doing as possible.
Thank you so much, Nicklas. I think we're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jillian.